This is another chart showing wildfires in the Coast Range through time. And just to point out that the variation, here's 1850, long before we ever had fire suppression or anything like that, and the red is areas burned. And then through the 1890s, 1920s, 1940s, and so forth, that variation over time. So one of the questions that I've been wondering about is how successful is fire suppression? There was a study done in the Northern Rockies between 1900 and 2003 that found that the majority of acreage burn occurred in 11 years. 6 of those years occurred prior to 1935, including the 1910 burn, a very famous fire in Idaho and Montana that burned 3.5 million acres. So, you know, huge fire. And then 5 years occurred since 1988. When this paper was done, was in they had data only up to 2003, and you might have an extra year or two put in there now. But the interesting point is 1935 through 1988. And here's a map showing fire history in Flathead National Forest and Glacier Park in Montana. And this map reflects the same kind of data. The red is fires from 1980 to the present. Yellow is 1930s through 1980, and blue is pre-1930s. And you can see between 1930 and 1980, there were very few fires in that whole region. Now, there's something that may account for all this. This is the area burned in 11 western states from 1916 to 2007. With transposed over that oscillation and currents off the coast of the Pacific Northwest and how that changes climate. During the period from basically from the 1940s through and into the 1980s, we had a cooler, moister time period. Now, what happens when it's cooler and moister? You're going to get less acreage burned, you're going to have less fires. And that's exactly the same time period which most people attribute to how successful fire suppression was. The question I ask is, was fire suppression that successful, or was it just not very good time for fires to burn? We had a lot of acreage burned prior to that, and we're getting a lot of acreage now that it's gotten warmer and conditions have changed. What is the real driving factor here then? Is it fuels, or is it maybe climate? One study, for example, that was done looking at Cascade fires, the main point is, read the last paragraph, however, evidence for low severity fires as the primary influence or abundance of old park-like patches was lacking in both the dry and moist mixed conifer forest. What they did is they looked over the whole region of Washington and Oregon, trying to find out whether this idea that we had low severity fires as common in the ponderosa pine, particularly forests, and they couldn't find the evidence for it. So is fire suppression additive or compensatory? In the years between 1935 and 1988, there were no significant fire years at all across the West. Coincides with a period of higher average precipitation and lower temperatures. This also coincides with the period of successful fire suppression. So, the question is, was the lack of big fires due to suppression or simply climatic conditions that inhibited big fires? Chicken and egg. Here's another important idea to get across. Which is more flammable, the dead snag there or the green tree? Yeah, that's what most people are going to say, the snag. Actually, under a drought condition, the green tree is more flammable because it has the green needles with the resins in it and the fine fuels. Most fires go on fine fuels. You know, you've all tried to make a campfire. You drag a big old log like that and you put your match to it, you can't get it to burn. You got to have fine fuels. Well, when this dries out, and you can still have green needles on it, and you get the fine fuels dried out, like for example in Yellowstone in 1988, green leaves in the green trees had 4% internal moisture, which is lower than kiln dry lumber. You take a match to green stuff like that, it's like that has gasoline in it. It goes up like crazy. So once a tree has lost most of its needles and fine small branches, it doesn't burn that well, actually. And then the other important point, by the way, is even after a fire, most of the biomass is left on site because it's mostly the fine needles and so forth and small branches that burn up in the biomass there. Anyway, another important point is big fires are needed. Any year, the vast majority of fires go out without burning more than a few acres. Doesn't matter whether we go and jump on it with smoke jumpers or whatever. Most fires actually go out on their own. So nearly all the acreage burned is the result of a very few large fires. And I've been trying to get the data for this, and I haven't gotten it yet, but what I'd like to get is a listing of all the fires burned in a typical year, because I'm guarantee you're going to find that, like, I've seen statistics on this. I just want to put the line this up on the screen for you, but only like 1 to 2% of fires account for like 99% of the acreage burned. So it's a very small percentage of fires in any one year that burn the vast amount of acreage. So if we think that fire is an important thing on the landscape and an important ecological process, even if we could stop big fires, I would be an advocate saying we don't want to. I don't think we can, but dead trees are reinvested in the next forest. We shouldn't be thinking about dead trees as being something bad. That's what helps to start and regenerate the next forest. And in fact, even interestingly, I saw, this is an aside, a study that was done a year or two ago found that 35% of the down logs, even in a clear cut, were from previous fires, left over, residual from fires before it was logged. And as was mentioned before, snags are critical to forest health. 30% of all birds in the Rockies are cavity nesters. They provide hiding cover for small mammals, salamanders, insects. Forms dams and slopes that slows water, holds snow, a snow fence effect. Provides stage, slows wind and security for wildlife. And we actually have a deficit of snags compared to the recent past because we have fewer acres of severely burned landscape than in the last century, if you remember that chart I had at the beginning. There are some people who are saying we need a lot more acres to burn than have been burning recently. 45% of all birds, this is across the whole United States, depend on dead wood. And then this is just an example. It's a specific example of a small thing, but there was a study done in Wyoming that found with marten, American marten, that if you eliminated the down logs, you didn't have marten in the ecosystem. And the reason is in a very cold winter, marten is a long, thin, weasel-like animal. It will burrow into to the woody, pulpy wood like you see in this picture to get away from the cold temperatures. And it doesn't go and doesn't do that most of the days. You know, it might only be 1 week in the winter that gets cold enough that that's important for the marten's survival. But if it doesn't have that down wood, then you don't have marten in that area. So sometimes these things are very subtle and not something you would think about. Fallen logs is homes to salamanders. In the eastern United States, I don't know if this is true in Oregon as well, but in the eastern United States, salamanders are the highest biomass of all vertebrates found in the forest ecosystem. We hardly think of them as being important, but they are major both food sources for other animals as well as major predators. They're almost like a top-down predator like wolves are on deer. And in places where you don't have a lot of salamanders, because you don't have a lot of logs, because it's all been cleaned out and sanitized to get rid of all the dead stuff, the other things in the soil break down the forest litter quicker and dry out the soil because it doesn't have as much mulch and make other changes in the chemical nature of the soil and so forth. So the salamanders are a big regulator of forest ecosystems, at least in the east. Another thing that is pretty interesting in terms of overall biomass, ants are they may be the most, if not one of the most, in terms of total biomass found in a forest ecosystem. And a lot of different species of ants depend upon down logs either further home or after it molders back into the soil for their habitat. And the ants are important for all sorts of things.